Today, we become legends.
Hey, so this video is going to be on the more basic side and mostly aimed at new players. That doesn't mean you can't learn something from it as an intermediate player or even an advanced player, but if that's not your style, then you're welcome to skip this one. But I've had a lot of requests either from new players or people whose friends are just getting into the game to explain how various stats work in Smite. Some of these stats are simply too basic to warrant an entire video covering them individually, so I decided on this video format where I'm going to explain every stat in the game, what it does, which gods it's generally useful for, and when you should build it. If you're looking for specific info on certain stats, then use the timestamps in the pinned comment down below or hover on the timeline bar of the video. But let's jump in. Movement speed. Pretty self-explanatory. Speed in Smite is given by percentages of your base speed, so if you have a 360 base speed and buy an item with 10% movement speed, you gain 36 speed. This naturally means that gods with higher base speed stats get more value from buying movement speed. The main items that give speed in Smite are boots, which you need on every god in the game, but other items like the katana tree, the ancient blade tree, among others can also give movement speed. This stat is affected by diminishing returns when going over 457 movement speed and has a hard cap of 1000, but we won't get too much into the details for the sake of time in this one. Cooldown Reduction, or CDR, usually comes in percentages and reduces your ability cooldowns by that percent. So if you have 20% CDR and use a 10-second cooldown ability, it'll start its cooldown at 8 seconds instead of 10. Some items, such as Spear of Desolation or Bracer of Undoing, also offer flat cooldown reduction, aka a set amount of seconds is taken off of your base cooldowns, but it's most common in the percentage form. CDR is a useful stat to pretty much every character in the game. If you rely on abilities, you're probably going to need CDR somewhere in your build, and if you rely on them to do most of your damage or usefulness, you probably want to be at the CDR cap by the time you finish your build, which is 40% cooldown reduction. Lifesteal comes in percentages and allows you to heal that percentage of your damage dealt after mitigations. Physical lifesteal only affects basic attacks, except in the specific case of Soul Eater's passive. However, magical lifesteal affects both basic attacks and abilities. Any ability that can hit multiple targets, be that physical or magical, is subject to a 1/3 multiplier on lifesteal to balance the game. So if you hit 3 people with a mage ability that does 300 to each person and you have 10% lifesteal, you'll heal 10% of 900, so 90 health, and then multiply by the AoE coefficient of lifesteal for 1/3, meaning you only actually heal for 30. This does not affect single target abilities or basic attacks, however. They lifesteal for the full amount no matter what. This reduction for area of effect abilities applies regardless of if you're actually hitting multiple enemies or not. An AoE ability hitting a single target will still have that reduced lifesteal compared to single target abilities or basic attack lifesteal. This stat is mostly common among hunters who use their strong basic attacks to heal using lifesteal, but some mages and assassins also use this stat quite well. On the topic, let's cover Antiheal. As you may have guessed, Antiheal will reduce enemy healing. This stat comes in the form of on-hit items for abilities and basic attacks, as well as auras that reduce the healing of nearby enemies and some god-specific abilities that also have this stat. 40% Antiheal will reduce healing by 40%, hit them with another 40% Antiheal and they will have 80% reduced healing, stack another 25% on top and they'll have 105% reduction. Antiheal effects and also healing boost effects will stack with each other additively and can go past 100%. So if you apply 105% anti-heal to an enemy, but then they increase their healing by 20% from one of their items, for example, they will go back to 85% reduction and won't be able to heal again. The exception to this is complete anti-heal abilities, which shut out all healing regardless of any other increases or decreases. This includes Odin's ultimate, Serket's ultimate, and Osiris's ultimate. Anti-heal and healing increases affects all kinds of health gain, so ability healing, regeneration effects, lifesteal, everything. The only exception being fountain healing, which is affected by neither increases nor decreases. It always heals at a constant rate. All anti-heal effects stack with each other aside from Contagion and Pestilence's aura effects. However, multiple of the same anti-heal effect will not stack, so 2 people with Divine Ruin will only apply 40% anti-heal, not 80%, but 1 person with Divine Ruin and 1 person with Brawler's Beatstick will apply 80%. Anti-heal is a criminally undervalued stat in Smite, and if you're a new player, it's one of the best things you can do to realise the power of this stat, and I highly suggest buying into it even if you're just going against some heavy lifesteal or self-healing. The enemy team doesn't necessarily need a dedicated healer god for anti-heal to be worth picking up, though of course you would buy it in that scenario as well. Attack speed. This stat comes in percentages and applies to your god's base attack speed stat, much like how movement speed works. So 20% attack speed on Jing Wei, who has a base attack speed of 1.0, will give 0.2 attack speed. However, that same 20% attack speed on Izanami, who has a base attack speed of 0.95, will give 0.19 instead of 0.2. Often this calculation doesn't matter too much since most gods have a base attack speed near 1.0, but it sometimes matters for gods with extremely low or extremely high base attack speeds. There is no diminishing returns on attack speed, aka buying 20% when you have 1.0 attack speed will give the same amount as if you have 2.0 attack speed. However, there is a hard cap of 2.5 for this stat, you can't go any higher than that with attack speed. As for reductions to attack speed, they work identically in that they key off your base attack speed, not your current attack speed. And only the strongest item reduction and the strongest ability reduction will apply. So if the enemy has 2 items that are reducing your attack speed by 20% and 30%, and also hit you with an ability that reduces it by a further 10%, only the strongest one from each category applies. So you would take the 30% from the item and disregard the other 20% item, and add the 10% from the ability on to get a total of 40% reduction. Attack speed is a stat bought by most hunters and some assassins. With some notable exceptions to the rule with mages and warriors, some of these gods love this stat and for others it's pointless, it depends on the god. Protections. I have a much longer video on protections that I'll link in the top right if you're interested in a more in-depth look at protections, but I'll cover them to a basic level here too. Protections protect you. Who would have guessed? Smite has 2 different damage types, magical and physical, and you need 2 different types of protections for each. Physical protection will do nothing to help you against a magical attack and vice versa. Protections follow this formula for reducing damage, which roughly means that 100 protections will halve damage you take, 200 protections will reduce it by 2/3, and 300 protections will reduce it by 3/4. There's a scale in between these values of course, but to a basic level that's how Smite reduces your damage through protections. This stat is mostly bought on tanks to keep them alive in fights, so warriors and guardians. However, sometimes squishies from the hunters, assassins and mages will buy into a small amount of protections if they're having trouble staying alive, but generally they won't invest into more than 1 protection item or so because they'll lose a lot of their damage output for doing so. Mitigations are similar to protections but are much more simple. If you have 20% mitigation, it reduces incoming damage by 20%. Likewise, if you have 10 flat mitigation, it reduces incoming damage by 10. Not much else to mention here aside from the fact that mitigations apply before protections. Penetration. If you just watched the protection section and thought it seems a little OP to halve your damage by buying 100 protections, this stat is what keeps that in check. Once again, I've covered this in way more detail in the video in the top right, but to a basic level, penetration comes in 2 forms. Flat penetration and percent penetration. Flat pen ignores a certain number of the enemy's protections, so if you have 10 flat pen and the enemy has 100 protections, you deal damage to them as if they had 90 protections. Percentage penetration, however, ignores their protections by a percentage, so if you have 20% penetration against an enemy with 200 protections, you deal damage to them as if they had only 80% of those protections, or 160 in this case. Percent pen is better against targets with extremely high protections, while flat pen is better against targets with low protections. 20% of 50 is 10 pen, but 20% of 300 is 60 pen. 20 flat pen is just always 20 regardless of if they have 50 protections or 300 protections. So effectively, you need flat pen versus squishy targets, usually mages, hunters and assassins, and you need percent pen against tanks, usually warriors and guardians. Often most damage dealer builds will have a combination of both flat and percent pen so that they can damage squishies and tanks effectively. Protection reduction is basically a subset of penetration. This comes once again in flat and percent values, and how I like to think about it is that penetration is personal in that you ignore the enemy's protections, whereas protection reduction is applied to enemies. So if you apply 20 protection reduction to an enemy, they physically have 20 less protections for the duration, meaning that they take additional damage from all sources of that damage type, not just from yourself, which is how penetration works. Once again, a more in-depth video on this is in the top right. True damage. This one is very simple. True damage ignores all enemy protections and does damage as if they have 0 defenses. This isn't very common in Smite, but some god abilities do have this effect. The only way to reduce true damage in Smite is through mitigations that I talked about earlier. Having 20% mitigations will reduce true damage by 20%, but no matter how many protections you have, you'll always take the same damage from a true damage source. Crowd control reduction, or CCR, does what it says on the tin. This stat comes in percentages and reduces the duration of CCs that hit you by that percentage. So if you have 20% CCR and someone stuns you for 1 second, the stun only lasts 0.8 seconds. And likewise, if you had 40%, it would only last 0.6 seconds. The hard cap for CCR is 40%, and it's worth noting that no CC can be reduced below 0.5 seconds by this mechanic, regardless of how much CCR you have or the initial duration. Diminishing returns also affects this, but it's a bit too in-depth for this type of video. I just thought I'd mention it, so if you're interested, you can look up more about it. And once again, I do have a more in-depth video on this topic if you're interested. Don't ask me why I'm covering physical and magical power so late in this video, but I am. Power in Smite is divided into two types, as mentioned before. Magical gods, aka guardians and mages, do magical damage and require magical power. Hunters, assassins, and warriors do physical damage and require physical power. Power applies differently to every ability and also to your basic attacks. Buying 20 power won't necessarily make your abilities do 20 more damage, that's not how it works. Abilities have power scaling percentages which determine how much power affects them. One ability might scale at 80% of your power, while another might scale at 40%. Basic attacks, however, have a constant scaling across all gods. Physical basic attacks always scale at 100% scaling, magical basic attacks always scale at 20%. This mechanic is what drives people to build into damage items in the first place. If all gods had 100% scaling on all abilities, everyone would just build the same way. Some gods have high power scaling, meaning they want to build into lots of power. These are usually squishy gods, aka mages, assassins, and hunters. While tanks generally have bad power scaling and get less value from building power, these are usually guardians and warriors. Critical chance. I'm sure if you've played any video game ever, you're familiar with how this works, but for completion's sake, I'll mention it here. Critical strikes do double damage and happen on a percentage chance. Items and some abilities give you a certain percentage of crit. With the notable exception of Ola Run and Fail Not, only physical gods have access to crit in Smite. Mp5 and Hp5. These stats stand for mana per 5 and health per 5. Basically, you get this amount of health or mana back in regen every 5 seconds. Don't ask me why it's measured in 5 seconds instead of every second, I really have no idea. But keep in mind that 50 HP5 is 10 health per second, not 50 health per second. Do I need to cover health and mana as separate stats? I feel like that's too basic even for a new player guide, but what the hell. Health gives you more total HP, allowing you to survive more hits. Mana is used to cast abilities. Having more mana equals more abilities before you run dry and have to get more mana somehow. Basic attacks don't require mana. There you go. But that's it for this video. Obviously, I brushed over some topics a little bit more lightly, and if you do want more information, then you can check out the videos in the cards. I do have a lot of separate videos that go a lot more in depth on these certain topics, but this was sort of meant to be more of like a brief introduction for new players, returning players, or like intermediate players that just want some more information. If you did enjoy this one, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 100k, so any subs are greatly appreciated, and I'll catch you guys later. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.